Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We welcome back Susan Kikoler to Edgware United Synagogue Education after an absence of almost 6 years. In May 2017, she spoke on the history of the Jews of Italy, and tonight she homes in on one of the regions of Italy with a talk entitled The History of the Jews of Lombardy, Mantua, Milan and Mantegna. Susan was born in London, but fell in love with Italy as a teenager on her first trip to Florence. After studying English language and literature at St. Hugh's College, Oxford, she went to teach in Syracuse, Sicily, where she remained for 5 years before moving to Canada and eventually back to the UK. Her portfolio career is based upon her interest in and knowledge of Italy, whether as a lecturer, writer, interpreter, or consultant. Since 2004, she has been the honorary director of the British Italian Society, the UK's leading Anglo-Italian cultural association with over 600 members. In 2005, she was awarded an Italian knighthood, Commander of the Order of the Star of Italian Solidarity, an award given by the Italian President as a recognition of outstanding contribution of promoting the knowledge of Italian culture in Britain. She is an expert in bringing the diversity of Italian life not only to her society, but also to the public at large, and is passionate about spreading the knowledge of the unique history of Jews in Italy. Susan's other great passion is theatre, and she has served twice on the panel of the Laurence Olivier Theatre Awards.
Right, well, firstly, thank you so much for coming out on a cold winter's evening to find out something about the history of the Jews of Lombardy. Lombardy, as you can see, is here at the very top of Italy. This is modern Italy. And what I want to show you, and is clear here, is just how near it is to a lot of different countries. And that has been incredibly important in the history of the Jews, because this was an area that was fought over, marched over by every single army in Europe over the centuries. And each time the government changed, so the history and the position of the Jews changed. Now, an important consideration is to remember that Italy was only united in 1861. Before that, this whole area was divided up into the Papal States, the Republic of Venice, duchies, kingdoms, etc. And as each area had its own history, its own dialect and traditions, so the history of the Jews was different in each area. Also, the Jewish population of Italy has always been tiny. Even today, it may be maximum 30,000 Jews in a population of over 60 million. And at no time in history has there been more than about 50,000 Jews in Italy. But as you will see, they have frequently punched way above their weight. Now, the study of the history of the Jews of Italy is a relatively new study. In the last century, there was Cecil Roth, and more recently, Shlomo Simonson, who have done extensive research into the history of the Jews there. But there is still a lot that we don't know. There's so many documents as yet to be examined, and probably a lot of documentation we don't even know of. And just to digress ever so quickly, this is a very exciting discovery. There is in Florence something called the Medici Archive Project, working on all the archives of the Medici dynasty. And there's one section which is called the Eugene Grant Jewish History Program. And in the autumn, I think the Jewish Chronicle actually covered this story, it was revealed that they'd come across a man called Iona Ostilio, who was an artist, the first Jewish artist that we know about in modern times. He lived in the ghetto in Florence, but he painted for the Medici. He lived in the 17th century, and he painted still lifes and landscapes for them. So, as I say, there's so much that we have yet to learn. And incidentally, this is a portrait. It's not yet understood whether it is by him or by one of his followers. And I found out today that in October, the end of October, there's going to be an exhibition in Florence at the Pitti Palace called The Medici and the Jews. So it's going to be a very, very interesting exhibition. Now, this is modern Lombardy. And I just want to point out a few places. We have Milan, as you can see, in the center. And then to the southeast, Mantua, and I'll be talking a lot about Mantua. And then as we go along, Cremona. Cremona today is famous because it was the home of Stradivarius. It's still famous for its violin making. We will talk about briefly Pavia, a university town. But I want you to look towards the middle and see there is a town called Brescia, and just above it, there's a little squiggle, which is Largo Iseo, or Lake Iseo. And it's there that our story begins, because in the 19th century, there was excavation near the lake, and Jewish tombstones were found. And what we know of these tombstones tells us that, well, one tombstone was the tombstone of a woman called Anya, and it says that she was a freed Jewish slave. Now, we know that when Jews were bought as slaves from Jerusalem, they could regain freedom. And it's known that some of the communities in southern Italy, like Puglia, were actually created and founded by freed slaves. But here we are in the north. And then of the other tombstones, we know there's a synagogue, because a woman is defined as a patron of the synagogue, and a man is called a deacon of the synagogue. But beyond that, we know nothing. It's been thought that maybe they were there in the area of this lake because there is iron ore around that area, and it was being extracted for coinage, which was very important. But as I say, there is so much we have yet to learn about Jewish history there. And in fact, we have to leap a long way forward to 1387 and Milan, when the Duke invites three Jewish brothers to go to the town of Pavia and open a money-lending banking facility there. Now, these Jews were from Germany, and many of the Jews coming into Italy at that time were from Germany because in the latter half of the 14th century, there was the Black Death, there was plague. And Jews frequently were accused of spreading the plague, and they were attacked, and it was very dangerous. So they were coming into Italy at that point. Now, the title of this talk is History of the Jews of Lombardy, Milan, Mantua, Mantegna. Well, Milan today, of course, is the powerhouse of Italy economically. Lombardy is the richest area in the whole of Italy. And Milan today has the second largest Jewish community in Italy, about maybe up to 10,000 people. Rome is the largest community. Mantua today is something of a backwater. It's a lovely Renaissance jewel, but not important. And the Jewish community is literally moribund. It's a handful. And there's a shul which opens about once a week, no minyan. But from the point of view of history, the really important history is in Mantua and not in Milan. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on Milan, but not as much as I'm going to spend on Mantua. So, as I said, 1387, the Jews are invited to be money lenders, of course, and this is the big activity throughout Italy and throughout Europe at this point in time. Useful for the ruler, because Jews are going to be heavily taxed. They're a milch cow for any ruler. Anything that they may do wrong, they may be put on trial, there will be fines, there will be taxes. And the local people have access to small loans at interest, because the church, of course, regards usury as a sin, and therefore are happy for the Jews to be the people who are indulging in this sin. As you will see as we go along, the relationship between the ruler and Jews really was very volatile, in the sense that there were rulers who were very friendly, who were very benign, others who were less so, but often even one who was benign always had to think of his own security. And there would be moments when perhaps the local populace, stirred up inevitably by the church, would be causing problems for the ruler. And at times he would have to be seen to be doing something about the Jewish problem. And we will see this as we go along. Well, here we have two dukes of Milan. Now, I should explain one of the reasons why Mantua is so much more important than Milan is in the brief history of the Jews in Milan initially, they were never allowed to live in the city of Milan. They could go into the city if they bought or paid for what is called a condotta, which is a kind of a license, which lasted 3 days. So they could go in, do their work, but they had to come out again. They could not have a permanent residence in the city. They could stay in a whole series of satellite villages, if you like, around the city. And we know that there were at least 24 of these in the Duchy of Milan. But they could not live in the center. And you'll see this is the difference, one of the differences with Mantua. The one exception to Jews living in the center was if the ruler wished to have his doctor nearby, because inevitably the dukes all had Jewish doctors. Jews were very famous for their medicinal abilities. And we know, for example, in 1435, there's a Jewish man called Elia di Sabato da Fermo, who was the doctor to Duke Filippo Maria Visconti and was living in Milan. And then in Mantua, there's a whole dynasty of doctors with the surname Portaleone, Lion's Gate, Lion's Door. And the first, William, was the personal doctor to the King of Naples in 1438. And the king knighted him. And then he went on to work for the rulers in Milan. And he lived in the city of Milan. Obviously, if you're not well, you want your doctor close too. You don't want him having to come in. And the son of Guglielmo was so famous, Abraham, that he treated the Duke of Urbino, and then he was lent out to treat a warrior who happened to be the cousin of the then Pope, Clement VII. And Clement VII wrote to him, thanking him for what he did for his cousin. So Jews as doctors lived well. Now, Francesco Sforza was benignly disposed to Jews. He defied the Pope, for example, when the Pope said that Jews should be deprived of at least 1/5 of all their goods because he wanted money for a crusade. Francesco did not do that. He defended 2 Jewish moneylenders in Pavia by giving them the title of familiari ducale, which means part of the Duke's family. And that was protection, so that no one would start with them because they were therefore starting with the Duke. And he encouraged a Hebrew printing press as well. Now, his brother, Ludovico Sforza, was less inclined to welcome Jews. But here we also have to talk about a very difficult period in Italian history. This is the second half of the 15th century. And in 1453, the Ottoman Turks capture Constantinople. And this is a tremendous shock for Europe, and particularly the Catholic Church. They are terrified that they are going to be overrun by the Muslims. And there are discussions about crusades, etc. But it means that people who are not Christian are looked on with even greater suspicion than before. And it's a period when monks are roaming the peninsula of Italy, preaching against Jews. Particularly one particular monk, Bernardino da Feltro, who we'll hear about later on. They were vicious in what they said, and in certain places there were massacres as a result. In Sicily, in 1474, there was a massacre. And very unfortunately, in that period, there was the famous blood libel in Trento, which you may know about. A young Christian boy called Simon was found dead near a Jew's house. Jews were accused of having killed him because they wanted his blood for matzah. And 8 Jews were arrested and put to torture. One of them, an old man, confessed under torture. They were put on trial. They were all killed, and the Jews were expelled from Trento. And it was a story that resonated throughout that area. Interestingly enough, both the Pope at the time and the Duke of the area at the time tried to stop the trial. They obviously realized it was trumped up. It was a trumped-up accusation. But the story stuck. And even then in the area of Milan, in a little town called Areno Po, in 1479, there was an accusation. A child disappeared, a Jew was accused of having done away with the child, was put on trial, and surprise, the kid turns up in the middle of the trial. So on this occasion, luckily, the Jew was saved. Another thing which happened in the area in 1469, and unfortunately happened in other periods too, there was a question of forced conversion, abduction and forced conversion. And the last case actually in Italy was, in fact, in the middle of the 19th century when Edgardo Mortara was abducted from his family. In this case, it was near Cremona, and it was a young married Jewish woman who was abducted and baptized and put into a convent. And there was quite a violent demonstration by the Jews on Good Friday of 1469 outside the Archbishop's palace and outside the convent, but they never got her back. So, unfortunately, these were some of the recurring situations that could happen. Now, as I mentioned, this is an area, the area of Lombardy, where armies were always fighting each other. And Ludovico Sforza lost his power to the French. They came in, but they in turn were fighting the Spanish. And at a certain point, Spain becomes a ruler of that part of Lombardy. And as you know, Spain had expelled all its Jews in 1492. For a period of time, they allowed the Jews to remain there. But in the latter half of the 16th century, the king is now Philip II of Spain. Now, it's the same Philip II who marries Mary Tudor here in England. And he decides, it's also the moment of the Counter-Reformation, when the church feels itself under threat, that he doesn't want Jews anymore in his kingdom, and he issues an edict of expulsion in 1590. The Jews do not wish to leave, and they try all sorts of ways, petitions, paying extra taxes, etc. And in fact, they do manage to prolong the expulsion, to prolong the edict. And in fact, it's only on the 23rd of June, 1597, that the Duchy of Milan can say that it no longer has any Jews on its lands. And the interesting thing now is to remember that there will be no Jewish life there from 1597 until about 1820. Now, before we go on to Mantua, I just feel I should show you one other place that you may recognize the name of, Soncino, because one of the things that did happen in Lombardy, there were a number of Jewish printing presses set up. And one of them was in Soncino. And I remember, and I think I've still got, Massa, which was with the name Soncino on it. And it comes from this small village. Now, the original family who set up the printing press were not called Soncino. They were German Jews, moneylenders. The name was Spira. And they'd come into Lombardy in the 14th century, first in Venice and then Mantua, etc., wandering around. And they eventually set up in Soncino in 1483. And they printed the Barachot to begin with. And between 1483 to 90, they printed 30 volumes, including the first complete Hebrew Bible. And when eventually they moved on, they took the name Soncino. This was very typical. Jews would say, I am Solomon from, and then give the name of the village, etc. In this case, it's Soncino. And of course, the most famous one was, Gershom, who went on to Venice and then on to Constantinople. So now we have to look at this, the area of Mantua. Okay, this is the little area, the Duchy of Mantua, and this is also the Duchy of Ferrara. And for our purposes, they are very linked. This is Mantua today. A beautiful little jewel of a Renaissance city. It's surrounded on three sides by a little river called the Mincio, which is a tributary of the River Po. And the Po, of course, is a major river in Italy. So in this period, having the water there was important for transportation and for commerce. And in that area, they had agriculture and wool and gold. There's a number of goldsmiths. We know that Jews lived in something like 48 different localities in the Duchy of Mantua. And the very first concrete evidence we have of Jewish people in the area, there is a mention in 1145 that Abraham ibn Ezra, the grammarian and philosopher from Toledo, was living there and studying there. And then he goes back there in 1153. Then in the 13th century, there are Jewish artisans, there are wool merchants, silk merchants, trading in grain, wine, and commerce, etc. But the important period for us, and its golden period, was when Mantua was ruled by the Gonzagas, a dynasty which began in the 15th century when one was made a marquis. And Francesco Gonzaga, who is the ruler at the time, marries Isabella d'Este, who is from Ferrara, from the ruling family Este in Ferrara. Now, it's an alliance, it's a political alliance, but it's a remarkably good alliance. Now, she is one of the great women of the Renaissance. If you can think of her perhaps in terms of, well, if I say Elizabeth I, she's highly educated. She knows Greek and Latin. She is a patron of the arts. She knows music. She plays the lute. She is graceful. She is magnificent. She dances beautifully. And we know that her dancing teacher is Jewish. This man, Guglielmo Ebreo da Pesaro, he was a very famous dancing teacher. In fact, dance was one of the Jewish trades, professions. He actually converted to Christianity, but he was always regarded as Guglielmo l'Ebreo. And this is a treatise on dance which he created. He was also the dance master of Lorenzo di Medici. So these people wandered the various courts and taught. But the important thing this is the Renaissance period, and Jewish scholars are ever present in the courts, whether they are translators, whether they may be teaching Kabbalah, because we know people, even bishops of the church, were interested in learning the Kabbalah. So there was a lot of interaction between Jews and non-Jews in the courts, far more perhaps than we realize. For example, Cecil Roth, who I mentioned before, he refers to Isabella's father, the Duke, Ercole. He liked to go gambling, and his best pal to go gambling with was a Jew. And similarly, we know the Medici family had great friendship with another Jewish family, and they would spend a lot of time together and wrote letters saying, "I'm so sorry, we haven't had time to see each other." So there is a much more interaction than perhaps we would really imagine. Now, I'm going to tell you two stories which I think will illustrate the complexity of being and the vulnerability of being Jewish in that period in the Gonzaga court or even Ferrara. But it would also show, I think, again, how the rulers' attitudes are not necessarily clear-cut. Now, as I said, in the ruling family of Mantua are the Gonzagas. The d'Este are in Ferrara. Both courts are welcoming to Jews. They welcome Jews from Germany, from other parts of Italy, from Spain and Portugal when they're being kicked out there. And they are living well. They can live where they want to. And this is a story about how this particular painting came to be created. Now, this painting was really the symbol of Mantua. It's called the Madonna della Vittoria, the Madonna of Victory. And the man on the left in his suit of armor is Francesco Gonzaga. Now, how did this happen and why did a Jew pay for it? Now, Francesco Gonzaga, and here I am quoting Shlomo Simonson, who's the great Israeli historian of Italian Jewish history, he maintains that Francesco was actually very well disposed towards Jews, and I can give you some examples. In 1484, he bans Bernardino da Feltro, this very, very anti-Semitic preacher. When he comes to Mantua, he will not allow him to preach in the main square. He sort of sends him away to somewhere really quite out of the way and says that he must preach with loving kindness and use language befitting a good churchman. When there's rioting against Jews at Easter 1490, and Easter is always a very difficult time for Jews, of course, Francesco issues a proclamation punishing Jew-baiting. Any child will be whipped, and any adult will be taken before the court. And in 1492, he permits some Jews, including some moneylenders, to carry arms. Now, Jews were not permitted to carry swords. But in this case, he's saying, yes, you may defend yourself. And he exempts them from having to wear any badge, any particular sign. And in 1513, he issues a proclamation to punish any Christian tormenting a Jew, and he continued to be protective. So, what is the story here? Well, in 1493, a very wealthy Jewish moneylender, banker, called Daniele da Norsa, bought a house in Mantua. And on the wall of the house, there was a painting of the Madonna and Child. Now, you could ask yourself, why did he actually buy that house? But obviously, he bought it. He did not want the painting to stay there, but he couldn't just take it down. So he asks permission of the bishop, who happens to be a Gonzaga himself, and the bishop agrees. He has written permission. The local people are not pleased when they suddenly see this wall being whitewashed, and they start scrawling things on and hurling stones at the building, but that's that. 2 years later, on the eve of Ascension Day, there is a Christian procession passing the house, and on this occasion, they find all kinds of graffiti mocking monks and priests and a lot of rude words attacking the church on the wall. And of course, they think it must be the Jew who's done it. And they riot, and they demand that he is punished for blasphemy. Luckily, Daniele da Norsa is not in Mantua that day. And when he comes back after a couple of days, he immediately begs pardon of Isabella d'Este, who is ruling in the absence of her husband, and she accepts his contrition and that he was not involved. And that seemed to be okay. But in the interim, the brother of Francesco, who is a man called Sigismondo, now in the Italian medieval times, in these duchies, it wasn't so much of the heir and spare as we have today, but if you had a second son, that son was destined for the church. And everybody wanted that son to eventually become a cardinal. And if you were a cardinal, you could potentially become pope. So Sigismondo has entered the church, but he has not arrived at any particular position of power. But he's ambitious. And more to the point, he can't stand the bishop, who happens to be his uncle. So he starts to plot with a monk called Girolamo Rendini, who's very anti-Semitic. And they convince Francesco that it's just not good enough, the situation, and that Norsa must pay for what he's done and that he must create a better image of the Madonna. And so Francesco demands that he pays, within 3 days, a sum of 110 gold ducats, or he will be hanged. Norsa pays up. But this is not enough. At this point, Rendini says, but why does he have that house? Why don't we take it and make a church of it? And that's what happens. So a church is built instead of the house. And in 1496, this painting, painted by Andrea Mantegna, who was the court painter to the Gonzagas, is given in procession to the church. Great for Francesco, because there he is, glorified. He's just been the great victor of the Battle of Fornova against the French. And everybody seems to be happy. We don't know much about Norsa, except that the following year, Daniele da Norsa is given a full pardon by Francesco Gonzaga and absolved of any guilt and any blasphemy. Not an easy place to be living in. I then want to show you another painting, which is a rather interesting one. This is also I should tell you, the painting, the Madonna della Vittoria, is no longer in Mantua. It was looted by Napoleon's troops and is now in the Louvre. This painting is in Mantua. It was painted in about 1515. We don't know who painted it. And it's meant to be a portrait, at least here, of Daniel da Norsa and his wife and son and daughter-in-law. Now, in many ways, it's an unusual painting of a Jewish family because, okay, on the one hand, yes, they are at the bottom of the frame, therefore they are being trod down upon by what for them would be the true faith, the true church. But if you actually look at the portraits, most portraits of Jews in this period, the Jew is depicted either as a devil or as a caricature. But these are remarkably human. And you can see, perhaps not clearly with this light, but you can actually see the badge. But they are very, very human faces. Right, the next story involves another family called Norsa. And this involves the Norsa Codex. In 2018, the Italian state paid €1,382,000 to acquire this beautiful manuscript, which is an Ashkenazi translation of Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed. It was created in Germany in 1349, and it was bought in either 1513 or 1516, it's not clear, by Moshe Benessa Norsa. And we know something about Moshe, that he was a banker, a patron, a founder of a synagogue in Mantua. And his family held on to this codex for 500 years until the present day. Now, his family originally came from Ferrara. As I said, the two courts were very linked. And in Ferrara, in 1434, there was probably his grandfather called Salomone. And he was a banker, but he was also a man of the Renaissance. And this, I think, is the interesting aspect of him, because he left poetry in Italian, in which he shows knowledge of humanism, knowledge of Latin writers, both Christian and pagan. And these sonnets were part of an exchange of poems between him and a Christian scholar in Ferrara called Giovanni di Pellegrino, who was a scribe to Lionello d'Este, who was the duke of the time. So you have this interaction of people. Now, the family take over the bank in Mantua, and then in 1501, Moisha takes over the bank there. And he has a great library. He has 14 printed books, 41 manuscripts, 5 Megillas, some bound in leather, some in silk, as well as books on logic and astronomy. So this is a cultured man living in a very cultured society. And this brings us on to the role of the Jews in the Mantua court, which was really quite remarkable. The number of Jews is increasing all the time in Mantua. By 1600, there are something like 3,000 Jews living in the city. It's 1/7 of the whole population. So it is a notable chunk. And the Jewish community in the city of Mantua becomes the go-to community for court entertainment. This might have started with the Purim plays, because we know that Purim plays were very popular with non-Jews. In Rome, we know that though the Pope had forbidden non-Jews to go into the ghetto and see the plays, they went because they enjoyed it, and obviously they were entertaining. And in the 16th century, in Mantua, whenever there was a marriage, a ducal marriage, or a visit of a famous person, the Jewish community was ordered to provide entertainment. This meant they had to provide a play, they had to write it, they had to act it, they had to pay for it. And they produced work of a very high quality. Now, Jews traditionally, when there was an important event, would be expected to parade and participate in some way. We know, for example, in 1469, when in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella marry, in Sicily, which is under Spanish rule, 400 Jewish young men and women in Palermo dance and celebrate the wedding. Here in Mantua, it's a much formal entertainment, and we know the names of some of the amazing people who participated. And perhaps one of the most remarkable was a man called Leon di Sommi, who was part of the Portaleone medical family. But in this case, he was a man of theatre. He started as a scribe, became more and more interested in theatre and in writing plays. And he wrote something like 16 volumes of pastoral comedies. That was the kind of entertainment that people wanted. Some of his plays were in Hebrew. But the most important thing from a historical and theatrical point of view is that he also wrote 4 treatises on theatre, 4 dialogues on the representative art, in which he spoke about how do you put on a play, how do you act it, how do you set the scene. So every aspect. We know he didn't like false beards, for example. And it has been regarded as, quote, the most memorable contribution by a professing Jew to general Renaissance literature. So, unfortunately, over the centuries, a lot of his manuscripts ended up outside Mantua, and in particular in Turin. in the main library there. And in 1904, there was a fire. So a lot of his work was lost. But luckily, there was a copy in the Palatine Library in Parma. So we have the treatises on drama. And he also wrote a pastoral drama for Purim called The Comedy of Wedlock. And this was in Hebrew, and it was only rediscovered and published in 1940. Now, if we think of the Elizabethan theatre and then the Jacobean theatre, from drama, theatre moved to a combination of drama and music with sort of interludes, intermezzi. And here again, the Jews were involved. Oh, I should mention a comment that is found in the archives that someone at court had issued this warning saying, look, when we get the Jews to perform, make certain it's not too near Shabbat. Because if it is, they're just going to garble everything in order to finish in time. So musicians, we have Jewish musicians, we have Jewish choreographers. We know of two harpists, Abramo dell'Arpa and his grandson, who were renowned for the beauty of their playing. There's a man called Isachino Marassoni, who was a singer, a harpist, a composer, but above all, a choreographer. And he was evidently a man of independent means. And he would frequently entertain the Duke in his own home. So again, this is not the kind of separation that one expects. But the most famous of all is this man, he is meant to be Salomone Rossi, the composer. He initially was an instrumentalist. He played the viol, the earlier form of violin, and a singer. He joins the court in 1587. He remains a Jew, because some people convert. No, he remains a Jew. But he is exempted from wearing a badge. He has his own group of musicians. And he's so famous that in 1612, the Duke of Mirandola asks him to be lent to his court because he hears that his music is so brilliant. He's famous for madrigals, for instrumental music. He establishes the trio sonata. He collaborates with Monteverdi. He actually publishes, with the help of Leon di Modena, the rabbi of Venice, his songs, which he here calls, the Songs of Solomon. And he did try to change the music even within the synagogue. He tried to make it more polymorphic, but the local people were more traditional, and they were not happy with that. His sister was a famous singer and actress. Her name was Madama Europa. The name possibly comes from a role that she might have undertaken. Her son was a composer. It is rumored that she might have been the Duke's mistress, but that we can't prove. And then in other areas, we know of women who were involved in printing. Estelina Cornat, the wife of Abraham, he was the first Hebrew printer in Mantua. And she helped him set up the fonts. And they printed not just religious texts, but astronomical tables, lunar calendars, etc. So I think you're getting the idea of this very, very cultured, very vibrant society. But then in the late 16th century, as I mentioned, clouds are darkening. It's getting more difficult. In Rome and in Cremona, the Talmud is burnt. In Mantua, there is also the order to burn the Talmud. What happens? The cardinal, who is Ercole Gonzaga, warns the Jews beforehand so that they can hide everything. He won't be able to find anything. But, as I say, it's getting harder and harder. Foreign Jews are expelled. In 1600, an old woman, a Jewish woman, Giuditta Franchetti, is burned as a witch. Now, she wasn't a witch. She was objecting to attempts at conversion. And then in 1607, 7 Jews are hanged because they were mimicking and making fun of the preachers and the friars. And unfortunately, it was a step too far. The Pope in 1555 had decreed that all Jews should live in ghettos. As you can see, this is not happening in Mantua. It happened in a lot of other places. In Mantua, it's only in 1610 that it is decreed that there will be a ghetto, and the ghetto does not start, is not in existence until 1612. But as I said, things are changing, and disaster comes in 1627, because the then Gonzaga Duke dies without an heir. The nearest claimant is a French Duke, and that does not please the Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, who regards Mantua as being his. And he sends in his army to conquer Mantua. They besiege the city. Jews are working with non-Jews to build the defenses, building the ramparts. They are working even on Shabbat, because we know there is a dispensation from the rabbi that they must do this even on Shabbat because it's to save their lives. Unfortunately, by 1630, the German mercenaries of the Emperor's army conquer Mantua. They ransack Mantua, they ransack the ghetto, they break into all the banks, they murder a number of Jews, and the Jews are then expelled from Mantua. It only lasts a few months, but the damage is considerable. Some of them manage to go to Venice. Some of them go to the west, to an area where there is the Prince of Bozzolo, who is offered sanctuary. But some of them go south to the area of the Duke of Mirandola. But in order to go south, unfortunately, they have to cross the River Po. You can see how it happens, we don't know. We know that they're being chased by bandits. Possibly the Po was in full flood, but somehow the rafts that they are using to flee capsize, and everyone is drowned. And it's close to 1,000 people. So a terrible tragedy. So eventually they are encouraged to return, but obviously it's a very different Mantua from before. And it's then in the beginning of the 18th century, it's taken over by the Habsburgs. It becomes an Austrian duchy. And under the Habsburgs, they are still heavily taxed, but gradually they do get more rights. They have the right to own property, to go to school, to go to university. But it's still a difficult time. And then at the end of the 18th century, Napoleon arrives with his troops. And wherever he arrives, the troops break down the ghettos. They burn the ghetto gates. In Mantua, the main square, which was once called Garlic Square, becomes Harmony Square. And there's a short-lived sort of local government in which a number of Jews participate. And there is a rabbi who goes to Paris to participate in Napoleon's Grand Sanhedrin in 1806. But then, as you know, the Austrians come back. Some of the Jews have to flee because they've been supporters of the French, and that's not something that the Austrians want to overlook. But we're now in the 19th century, and the fascinating aspect of Jewish life in the 19th century in Italy is how many Jews participate in the fight for Italian unity. They are incredibly patriotic. If you think of the main characters in the fight for Italian independence, Garibaldi, the warrior, Cavour, who becomes the first prime minister, Mazzini, who is the philosopher. Cavour is backed by Jewish banking families from Turin. Both he and Mazzini have Jewish secretaries, their right-hand men. When Mazzini flees to London, his Jewish secretary comes with him. And when he goes back to Italy as a dying man, he dies in the house of a Jewish family. And here in Lombardy, in the area of Mantua, we also have some stories. Now, I'd just like to show you one image here, which is actually not from Mantua, it's from Emilia-Romagna. But as you can see, it's a ketubah. But it's a ketubah with, at the top, the head of the king. To the right, we have Garibaldi. To the left, we have Cavour. And probably at the bottom was once Mazzini. So the patriotism was such that you even put these figures on your ketubah. And here in the area of Mantua, this man, Giuseppe Finzi, played a very important role in the fight for independence. Now, he comes from a wealthy family. His family, once the Austrians gave permission to own land, went into business in silk weaving. They had 2 factories. They planted 24,000 mulberry trees, and then they diversified into leather and grain, etc. So a wealthy family. He's born in 1815, goes to university as an engineer, and gets involved in these new revolutionary ideas. In 1844, he comes to London to meet Mazzini. And Mazzini entrusts him with propaganda in Lombardy to stir up the people. He then gets involved in the fighting in 1848, when there were revolution all over Europe, and he fights in the area of Mantua. He fights in the king's army. He fights against the papal army and against the Austrians, gets captured, court-martialed, sentenced to 18 years in prison. But then there's an amnesty. So he's free, and he starts again. He goes to Garibaldi. And Garibaldi entrusts him with the finances for the invasion of Sicily, for the weapons and the ships. And Finzi realizes immediately there's not enough money. He goes to Cavour, who gives him secret funds so he can finance the invasion. And he's there with Garibaldi at the invasion. So he's with all these main figures. He actually acts as a mediator between Garibaldi and Cavour when they're not getting on. And then from 1860, he serves for 25 years in Parliament, in the lower house. And then eventually, in 1886, he's made a senator. So someone who is really in the thick of the fight for independence. So, another man, Italy's first Jewish senator. He was actually from a journalistic background. And just to conclude, because I know time is marching on, as you can see, in the 20th century, the Jewish population of Mantua is shrinking. By about 1930, it's barely 669 people. In World War II, some people were arrested. Some people are deported. I've seen conflicting figures. Some say 40, some say 50. As I said, today, it's literally a handful of Jewish people living in Mantua. But before we conclude, just a couple of, I hope, interesting facts. As happened in other parts of Italy, Jewish dishes become local dishes. And up to recent times, there was a particular dessert or pastry which was made of flour molasses, which was called purem by the locals, and is meant to come from something that was eaten by the Jews at Purim. And there was also, and this is not unique to Mantua, it happened in Rome, in Venice, etc., the Jews living there had their own sort of mixed dialect of the local dialect and Hebrew. And in Mantua, there was sort of cross-pollinization because even the non-Jews picked up some of the language. And even to recent times, the word in the Mantuan dialect for a ne'er-do-well, a thief, was ganal, from ganav, which is perhaps not the best word to have picked up, but anyway. But let's conclude with this very, very beautiful shul. The Norsa Torazzo synagogue, founded in the 16th century by Norsa, who bought that beautiful manuscript. And it was actually founded in 1513. It was rebuilt in 1751. It was then demolished and then rebuilt again between 1899 and 1902 in another street. It's now a national monument. Originally, there were 6 shuls in Mantua, 3 Ashkenazi, 3 of the Italian rite. Over the last century or so, these have been closed, and a lot of the accoutrements, particularly Aram Kodesh, etc., were shipped to Israel. So they are in different locations in Israel. So, life has gone on. Mantua, now a tiny community. Milan, a much bigger one. I'm sorry I haven't been able to address modern Milan. If you have a question, maybe I can answer it afterwards. But thank you so much for listening, and I hope it's been a rather intriguing evening. Thank you. Just a couple of things. Ferrara, which I mentioned, the city of Ferrara today houses the Italian Jewish Museum, rather beautiful museum. It's not the Holocaust Museum. They have yet to create one, and that is meant to be in Rome when it's eventually built. But Ferrara, because of its long history of having a Jewish community, it was decided that they would have their Jewish museum there. And they do have very interesting exhibitions. If you go online, a lot of their work is in English too, so you can follow up different aspects of the history there. Flora.
Fantastic, really so interesting and riveting. Please remind me, when did the Jews go back to Milan? Because, you know...
Oh, sorry, I didn't have a chance. Okay.
Yeah, I wanted...
Right.
Yes.
What happened was, as I mentioned to you, we had the Austrians, then Napoleon, then the Austrians again. A lot of Jews, like Giuseppe Finzi's family, have done very well. That causes resentment among non-Jews. You've got to remember one thing in particular. 19th century, Jews on the whole can read and write. We have to. We have to be able to read. We have to be able to read prayer books and everything. The average Italian couldn't. This is a very, very important consideration. It was only really the upper classes in Italy who could read and write. So Jewish people had immense advantage over others. And being enterprising, they did well. It caused resentment, and there were some incidents against Jews in the 1820s and I think 1840s, and people began to feel perhaps that we should move on. So a small group of about 7 families moved to Milan in around 1820, but they were still part of the Mantua community. Gradually, more families moved in, but Milan doesn't become a separate community until about 1866. Okay? Let me just see if I can find my piece of paper, which I did not have a chance to look at before. As I say, today it's the second largest community after Rome. It's a very cosmopolitan community in Milan because Jews who come there, for example, from Libya. Many Jews, when they fled Iran, went to Milan. When other Jews from Arab lands went there. So the community consists of at least Jews from about 15 different countries. And there are about 13 synagogues with various rites, from Italian, Sephardi, Ashkenazi, Iranian, Lebanese, etc. Milan holds the main center for Jewish documentation in Italy. And as the one person I wanted perhaps to introduce you to bring things up to date. This is I don't know if anyone has heard of her, Liliana Segre. She's a remarkable woman. She's 92. She was a survivor. She was taken to Auschwitz with her father when she was a young girl. And she is famous in Italy as an outspoken critic of anti-Semitism. She was made a senator a few years ago, and she has used it as a position to warn against racism and anti-Semitism, and she really calls it out. Unfortunately, not everybody likes this. She has had a number of threats, and as a result, she has an armed guard. And also, she has denounced various people who've sent messages, threatening messages on TikTok, and stupidly enough have left their names on it. So there's going to be court cases against these people. But she fights very much against anti-Semitism and to keep the memory of the Holocaust. And earlier last week, I should explain, in Milan, there is this Holocaust memorial, which is subterranean, because the Milan railway station is the only railway station in Italy where trains for Auschwitz actually left. So it's still a historical place. And so for the longest time, there's been this memorial with the train. There is the carving there, indifferenza, indifference. As she said, that's what she remembers most when she was shunted onto the train with her father, was to the way that people just passed by. And what she's been fighting for, and she managed to get finally last week, was, if you can see on the left here, a sign explaining to any visitor coming into Milan station that below there is this Holocaust memorial, because beforehand there wasn't a particular sign which showed people where it was. You really had to know in order to visit it. But now that is there permanently. Binario 21, platform 21. And Italian school children this is part of their education, certainly in the Milan area, are all taken to that area. There are many schemes to actually take children to Auschwitz to actually see the camp. So she has been fighting for some time, and she is a great celebrity in Italy today, a remarkable woman.
Thank you. Can I ask one very quick question? That we have Rothschilds here in England. Is there any distinguished man that is badly distinguished himself, like who has some see?
Right, well...
He's allowed this, I know, families still...
Yeah, no, the Olivetti, remember Olivetti typewriter, Jewish? And in fact, the person, the Carlo di Benedetto, who is the grandson or something of Olivetti, is very prominent. Jews are very prominent in Italy. In some ways, one could say too much, because that's what the anti-Semites... Well, I couldn't get a precise number. One document said 6,500, another one said 10,000. The same in Rome, it's about 12,000. It's very difficult to get a complete picture, but basically it's the main centers is Rome, Milan, and then much smaller Turin, and then the much smaller again Venice, and then tiny communities, Naples, and lots of really tiny places, because as happens everywhere, people leave the little places for the big city where there's more opportunity.
Can I ask you about Brescia?
Brescia, yes.
Brescia, not now, but going back.
Yeah.
Were there Jews there, and did they have a synagogue, or?
We don't know. When I mentioned the tombstones that were excavated, they were excavated not in Brescia, but by the Lake Iseo. Okay? Today, the tombstones are in a museum in Brescia. And Brescia has a long history. It was called Brexia in Roman times. But as far as I'm aware, there isn't a Jewish community there today. But it's a very interesting little town. And this year, Brescia with Bergamo, which is very nearby, are the Italian cities of culture for 2023.
Before the Risorgimento and reunification of Italy, was the attitude to anti-Semitism much the same in all the independent states, or could Jews go from one place to another? Was anti-Semitism the same at a particular time in the various regions?
Oh, that's a very difficult question. I mean, yes, Jews on the whole could, well, they did. You know, something got bad in one area, you went to another one.
Yeah.
Whether people thought in terms of anti-Semitism, I think it's probably a more modern concept that we talk about that. Jews were the other, and they were both necessary because they were, I mean, not just the fact they were money lenders, but they represented, after all, the church did recognize that Jesus was a Jew. They also recognized, I mean, that the Jews were the people of the Bible. And that's why you have this sort of ambivalent attitude towards them. So when the Pope says 1555, Jews have to be in a ghetto in Rome and everywhere else, and the ghetto walls are closed, at the same time they are both being separated and in a way protected. As I say, they are the people from which their savior came, but at the same time, Jews refusing to accept that he was the savior are those, therefore, inherently in the wrong. But I don't think anyone would actually define it as anti-Semitism at that point.
Thank you. So, Susan, thank you very much for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
The question I was going to ask is, do you think that the reason why there were so few Jews in Italy is because Italy was the birthplace of Catholicism with the Pope? It puzzles me that there were so few Jews in Italy and now the same.
Who knows? It's difficult to say. Sicily, for example, before 1492, had one of the biggest Jewish populations in Europe. They had 30,000 Jews. Then, of course, the Spanish kicked them out. One of the reasons in Italy why the Jewish population tends to be small is certainly from the 19th century, it's a very assimilated population. In about 1938, the time of the racial laws, under Mussolini, it was calculated that 46% of all marriages were mixed. So you're looking at a very high percentage. Similarly, a lot of Jews emigrated. Under fascism, they went to Switzerland, they went to America, they went to South America, and then a lot of Jews emigrated to Israel. So I think it's never going to be a big number, but if you brought back all those Jews, you'd probably find that the population in Italy would be reasonably substantial. I don't know to what extent the vicinity of the Catholic Church of the Pope made that difference. Because again, because it was so cut up into different ruling areas, it's depended sometimes on not on the Pope, but on the ruler. Was it the King of Naples? Was he going to kick you out? Or is the Duke of Milan going to kick you out? Regardless of what the Pope is saying. So it's incredibly complex. But thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Susan for her expert talk on Lombardy and her enthusiasm for the topic. We're most grateful for all the detailed research you've undertaken for this fascinating lecture. And we shall place a recording of tonight's lecture on the Edgware United YouTube channel shortly. We look forward to Susan returning in the future to discuss another region of Italy.